Ahora nuestros siguientes participantes, ¿verdad? Nuestros siguientes oradores son invitados y la próxima conferencia quiero darle la bienvenida a dos empresarios. Tenemos de Greenboard Solutions a Bianca Cabán y a Marvin Rhone. Un fuerte aplauso.
Muchísimas gracias. Buenas tardes. I'm Bianca Caban, and this is Marvin Rhone, my partner. I'm a diaspora Puerto Rican, born and raised in New York City. I graduated from Harvard with a degree in political science and economics, and I started my career on Wall Street, working at firms like BlackRock and Credit Suisse. I'm now an entrepreneur working on revitalization projects in Puerto Rico and mainland US. And I'm here with my partner, Marvin, where we're collaborating on projects in the regulated cannabis space. Marvin graduated from Brown with a degree in economics. He then went on to work on Wall Street at BlackRock, in London and New York, creating technologies for large global financial firms to better assess the risk on their balance sheets. So Marvin has a very heavy tech background and has built a career creating software as a service platforms. He is now translating that skill set to the regulated cannabis industry in his home state of Washington. So Marvin, can you tell us why you went from Brown to Wall Street to the regulated cannabis industry? Is it because you really hated to wear a suit and tie that much?
Oh, well, you know I am a farm boy at heart. Be here in my overalls if I could. No, it's because studying economics, working on Wall Street, you learn to think like an investor. And investors are obviously always looking for growth. The two main drivers of growth are always technological innovation and changes in regulations. So when I found out that the voters had passed Initiative 502, legalizing and regulating cannabis, I saw a huge opportunity for explosive growth in my home state.
So this was in 2013, where Marvin went back home to Washington State and was one of the first license holders in distribution in Washington State. And as we can see, these are the economics of the cannabis market right now in the mainland US. Billions of dollars at stake here, and obviously this was a key driver for Marvin going into the space. If we take a look at what is the state of affairs in the cannabis industry in mainland US, we know that there are 4 markets where marijuana is recreationally legal: Washington State, Colorado, Alaska, and Oregon. And there are 23 markets, or states I should say, where cannabis is legal for medicinal use. So Marvin, what has this meant for Washington State when it comes to tax revenues, to economics?
Well, sure. The first thing to notice is that we've, since the first dispensary opened, had month-over-month growth in the market. You can't see it here, but on the next slide, you can see that we've had over $200 million in tax revenues in just a couple of years. I can't overstate how big of a deal this is for our local economy. For example, in the city I grew up in, I've seen it completely revitalized. We've had our local budget holes completely filled. We have extra money going to parks and schools. Tons of new industries created. It's really been truly lucrative.
And walk us through the process of what was it like getting a license? Back in 2013, when the recreational market opened in Washington, because we know Washington State has had a medicinally legal market for about 10 years. So when the recreational market opened up in 2013, you were there, you were first. What was it like getting a license?
Well, the great thing about what Washington did was they wanted to make sure that people who voted for the initiative to pass were actually the people who were participating in the supply chain. So regular folks, a lot of first-time business owners, for example, were actually able to get licenses and to start operating, which is pretty unique, actually, in some of these states, but it's why we have such explosive growth.
That's great. So we can see there's still growth coming yet in Washington State, right? We've got thousands of producers and processor licenses about to come due, as well as thousands of retailer licenses. So tell us what it's like in terms of who are the stakeholders in the Washington market, and how does the state regulate them? There's this thing called a seed-to-sale system, which most people many people might know about. But tell us about that. How did Washington choose a seed-to-sale provider, and how do they regulate the space?
Sure. So obviously, Washington and every state with a regulated industry is primarily concerned with making sure that patients have access to safe products, standardized products. We have a large requirement for quality assurance, controlling things like bacteria, mold, and even levels of THC, CBD, CBN. In terms of the need for the seed-to-sale system, there's also the fact that the state needs to be able to regulate the market and needs to be able to ensure that they know what's being sold so that they know what their tax revenues should be.
So basically, at the very basic level, a seed-to-sale tracks every plant, gets a serial number that's then traced to the final product that's consumed for recreational use or medicinal use. That's at the core of it.
Exactly, and the importance of that is also that if there's, for example, a recall or a plant gets somebody sick or something terrible happens, we're always able to find out exactly where it came from so we can solve those problems before they spread. Luckily, that hasn't happened yet, but we are prepared for that if it does happen.
Great. So let's talk about the operations of this space. When you first went in 2013 to take a look at this market and investigate, you went to a grow operation and you said, how can I collaborate with you? It's a very collaborative industry by its nature. And what did they ask you? You have this very impressive background in economics and tech, but what did they want from you?
Well, the first thing they asked me, the guy, he said, so are you an engineer? And I said, no. And he said, that's unfortunate. I really need an engineer. And that was when I learned that these are incredibly high-tech operations. I mean, it really is precision farming. You need to be able to control the type of light that the plants get throughout the vegetative and flowering processes. You need to be able to control the amount of water that they're getting, obviously, the nutrients in that water, the humidity in the room, the temperature in the room. If any of those variables are off with respect to the strain that you're growing, it can have a devastating effect on your entire grow. So the more automation, the more standardization, the better, really, in this industry.
And what do you think, we're at a technology conference. How do you think technology, with someone of your background who has built technologies at the highest levels for global financial firms, how can technology positively impact the cannabis industry, the regulated cannabis industry?
Oh, well, it really is all about technology. It's really risk management. It's managing downside risk and then also finding ways to bring techniques from the larger agricultural industry to this industry that has been underground for quite a long time.
We visited a farm in Puerto Rico and you were impressed by their operation. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, we traveled down to Semilla and saw their cocoa farm, and we were very, very impressed. Obviously, they're growing a different plant, but the techniques are precisely the same. It was a way of actually cutting costs, using nature, really truly thinking about how do we grow a plant in the best way possible.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about Greenboard Solutions. What is it? Why did you start developing it? And why are we now trying to take it across the country and hopefully to Puerto Rico?
Well, Greenboard Solutions, really excited about it. It's a value add on top of a seed-to-sale traceability system. So you can do all the functions that you are required to do by law in the app, but there's also a lot of extra features. For example, in Washington, we have thousands of businesses that need to communicate with each other. So we took the fact that they all also need to communicate with the state and used the technology to make it easier for them to buy, sell, trade, communicate with each other.
That's great. So tell us more about, Greenboard Solutions. You've developed this technology. We can apply it to different sort of agricultural businesses in Puerto Rico. Shifting gears to Puerto Rico, we have engineers, we have the right climate, we have innovative agripreneurs in the audience and all across the island. Given your strong knowledge of an operational market, one of the first ones, which was Washington State, what are the best practices or knowledge that we can take and apply it to Puerto Rico, who is now thinking about developing a regulated cannabis regime in the medicinal side of things, but what can we learn from Washington? How does it apply to Puerto Rico?
Sure. Well, the best thing, as I mentioned about Washington, was that the people were actually involved in the supply, which was, it still continues to be incredibly important because there is a phenomenal amount of demand. In fact, the marketplace in Washington, we always joke, it's not competitive between cannabis businesses, it really is collaborative. Supply is still trying to meet demand. So having many players is definitely a very good thing. The other thing that we learned from Washington, that I've learned from Washington, is access to licenses is imperative. Things like background checks, in excluding people from being able to get licenses for having marijuana offenses has really cut down on the number of licenses that there could be. And so a lot of those things are being lifted, and the market is actually trying to become more open and accepting of people who have been involved in the industry.
That's great. What else would you tell us? Anything else we're missing?
I'd say that I think I covered it.
You covered it? All right, so are there any questions from the audience? Any questions? Yes. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm from Seattle too, so thanks for coming down. I was just curious. You spoke about some of the requirements for entry and whatnot. Could you speak a little bit about perhaps what the range of an investment, of initial investment, any person who's wanting to get into the growing industry might have to need in order to raise the funds for it?
Sure. So in Washington, one of the requirements initially was, just to have a space to use. So if you already own property, it's pretty much the investment that you would need. In my case, I didn't own a property I could use, so I had to get a lease. So the cost of the lease was, it was pretty small. And the landlord, I was fortunate enough to find a landlord who was also in the industry. In terms of the equipment and things of that nature, I mean, at the end of the day, it really is a weed. It grows naturally outside. So growing it inside, while it can be challenging, is really not that expensive, which is really good. Now, if we're going to talk about some of the larger grows that are tens of thousands of square feet, of course, we can get startup costs in the millions of dollars. But to get started in general, it's not necessarily very expensive.
Any other questions? We have one up here.
I have the microphone here. So
Thanks.
keep that one.
Hi, I had a couple of questions. One, the part of, from an investor point of view is the banking and trying not to make it a cash-only business. Now I heard in Washington, D.C., a friend of mine he has a wine business and also a cannabis business. And the banks are taking it. They say, we just notify the treasurer and let them take action if they want to. I wonder what your experience is in that part.
That's a great question. So when the market in Washington first opened, it was 100% cash only, which obviously is not only inconvenient, but potentially unsafe. So very quickly, some local credit unions stepped in and decided to offer checking accounts for the legalized cannabis businesses, which is wonderful, but we're still waiting for things like financing to be available. Right now, we just have very basic business services. In terms of where we're going, I expect personally that we will see federal reclassification, rescheduling of cannabis, and once that happens, we're going to see banks moving into the industry.
Another question, por allá. Si se puede ir levantando en lo que llego para avanzar por aquí, por aquí.
So back to the financing issue, it would seem that venture capitalists would be making a killing in terms of providing services. How is the FDIC seeing that? Is there a possibility of creating some kind of a marijuana co-op that would work? Do you see those things it would seem to me that Puerto Rico, other than just cultivation, having a series of laws that already implement exporting and services and having a tax advantage for that here, and having also a place where you can relatively cheaply set up a bank compared to the States, would be something worth considering in the market. And could you talk a little bit about that, and from the Money Act, where do you think this is going?
Sure. Well, it's very similar. So for anything FDIC federally involved, there really is we're waiting. We're playing the waiting game. We're waiting for the rescheduling, which is, like I said, I think will happen. In terms of Puerto Rico's role in the cannabis world, or the cannabis market at large, Bianca and I have really been talking a lot about the fact that there are so many engineers here. There are so many people like yourselves who are focused on agriculture. Your knowledge and ability to build things and solve problems and innovate is really what we need right now. We have a lot of people. I always use the example. We have a guy in my hometown who bought an old Costco, closed down Costco, and he tried to fill it up with plants, and he'd never grown anything before, and he failed very miserably, and he lost a lot of money. If he had had access to people like I've met here today, that would never have happened.
The one other point that we talk about a lot is the fact that this is a cash-rich crop. Obviously, we can see the numbers. So the ability for cannabis growers and cannabis entrepreneurs to invest in R&D is going to be paramount relative to other agricultural spaces. So that's great. But at the same time, we can also take information from current agriculture technology and apply that to the cannabis space. So can you talk about that exchange?
Right, it's a virtuous cycle. So, from people growing plants in their closets, now we have, like I mentioned, these very large facilities, very professional facilities. What we're seeing is a large migration of technologies from the larger agricultural world into this new legal cannabis world, which is wonderful. But what we're also seeing, as you mentioned, is as soon as a grower makes a harvest, they're cash rich. And the first thing that grower wants to do is reinvest in their grow operation, make it scale it, make it safer, make it more automated, essentially innovate. Every grower has their own process and is constantly trying to figure out how to optimize it. Now, the wonderful thing about that is, like I said, cannabis is just a plant. So those techniques that we're using to optimize our cannabis grows are now going to be exported back to the larger agricultural world, which is what I'm personally very excited about.
Awesome. Is there anything that, on this trip that you've learned from Puerto Rico in terms of agriculture that could be applied to the cannabis space in Washington State?
Oh, absolutely. Just the fact that there are so many people who think of agriculture as a tech industry. The farm that I partnered with first in Washington State was, an elderly couple. They're kind of your stereotypical farmer couple. They did everything by hand. They trimmed by hand. They watered by hand. They turned the lights on and off by hand every day. And over the last few months that they've been operating, about the last couple of years actually, I've seen them actually move much, much more into high-tech things. For example, they've replaced all of their high-pressure sodium lights with very high-tech LED lights that give the exact right spectrum to the plant throughout its growing process. I mean, these are things that honestly, for a professional agricultural company, are very basic, but in the marijuana world, they're still revolutionary.
And we talked a little bit in the beginning about revitalization. How do you see revitalization playing out the way it did in Washington in a place like Puerto Rico with regard to the regulated cannabis industry?
Sure. Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is just the tax revenues. They're enormous. Washington has an effective 25% tax on cannabis, and it's going to go higher. And that's why it's been so lucrative for the state. But what's more interesting than that to me is the companies like Greenboard, like ours, that are springing up to service the cannabis businesses. You have everything from graphic design to IT to just office supplies. I mean, it cannot be overstated the economic impact that starting thousands of new businesses all at once will have on a local economy.
Excellent. Well, that's about our time. Muchas gracias por invitarnos, and have a great rest of your day.